Welcome back, everyone, to our next session, a conversation on can AI put humans first? And the conversation will be between Renée Richardson Gosline, our IDE research group lead, Human First AI, and Sanjeev Vohra, the Senior Managing Director and Global Lead for Applied Artificial Intelligence at Accenture.
Thanks. Welcome. Thank you for joining us for this conversation. Sanjeev, hi, good to see you again.
Hello, Renée, and hello, everyone.
Hello. Greetings from Massachusetts in the middle of a snowstorm.
And this is not so far, New York.
Great. So for everyone on the call, on the webinar, Sanjeev and I are going to have a fireside chat minus the fire, although today would be a good day to be sitting fireside. And so it's really going to, I think, naturally follow conversation, natural language, if you will, for the topic. And I guess I want to start with probably what everybody's been doing over the last couple of weeks, which is playing with ChatGPT, playing with, Bing AI, playing with a bunch of these large language models that are out here and have now been released. Sanjeev, have you played with them at all? Have you had a chance to tinker just as an individual, not necessarily as an Accenture lead, but as an individual with these products?
So I was playing much before it was released, but that's a different thing. But since the day it was released, the next day, I think it was a weekend on the first end of November or first week of December, and I got hold of that news. So I started playing around that, but it's been a tremendous, and my first reaction was awesome. Like, gosh, this is like pretty cool. It can actually answer things that are difficult questions, actually. And so it's gets you to get more attention, as you may know. But one thing which I've been really using it very effectively on a personal side, which I should mention, is things which I needed help on. So I've been asking ChatGPT to do haikus for me, and so it's fast, it's fast, it's prompt. And like, for example, yesterday I was with one of my clients, and they are a big, large company in the construction business and logistics business. And I was talking to the CEO, and I did a haiku, and I said, look, this is what ChatGPT is telling about your company and your future of the company. He was super excited about that. So that's how I've been using it in my interaction with the client. But the same thing applies to my family as well. So I asked ChatGPT to write a poem for my son's birthdays, and I did some modification, but it was very, very well written poem.
Oh, that's really interesting. So on my end, I have been tinkering with it as well. And just initially, because I teach from an educational perspective, I'm assuming that my students, whether they be MBAs or doctoral students or even executives, are going to be employing ChatGPT for efficiency's sake. And so one thing I'm going to be doing is changing my syllabus content and assigning ChatGPT and other types of large language models, because I want to sort of, anticipate the reality that people are busy and they're relying on these, but also I want them to do it with an eye toward what is it generating and where are the vulnerabilities? What is not an accurate depiction of what you know, right? So giving them the opportunity to ask the questions and surface the questions to identify the gaps between what these large language models are generating and what they, as humans who are critical thinkers and have cognition, would arrive to, and sort of where the gap is in between. And so I love the idea of saying, this is what's out there about your company, about your firm, and identifying the gap between what is the conventional wisdom as reported by a large language model and what is actually the truth and what you want the truth to be. So I love that orientation. And I think that brings me to sort of what I would like us to think about and talk about in this conversation. And for those of you who are on the webinar, please feel free to put questions or reflections in the chat. Sanjeev and I are happy to sort of involve more people in this conversation. I don't know if it's a good thing for you to put a question into ChatGPT and then put it into the chat for us, but that's another level of questioning. So I guess, Sanjeev, what are you seeing in terms of the reaction of firms on your end? Because from my end, being in the world of academia, I'm interested to see the overlap between the kind of narrative arc we're seeing in our different worlds.
No, sure, and I can give you a perspective. Look, this is the one area which we have invested hugely as a company, because our role as a company is to we are the intersection of advanced technologies like artificial intelligence and human ingenuity. So, for example, how humans and AI can actually create value for large organizations. The value is not only the business performance value, it is beyond that. It's about sustainability, it's about social cause, it's about brands, everything else, right? Everything put together for a value for a company. So we have been using it, and and our philosophy has been very clearly, on looking at artificial intelligence and finding out the right use cases. So if you ask me personally, what I get excited about is obviously AI and everything behind AI. For example, I'm very passionate about data, right? And we'll talk about it a while, but I'm very passionate about data itself. But the most important thing is what I call is AI to value. So how do I generate the value out of this technology, keeping humans in the center of everything, right? So whether it's a end consumer, for example, as a user, which I'm using it, I'm aware of it that it's AI, but I'm also aware of that it's AI plus human plus other people involved, the whole system involved behind the interaction. As a user of a company or any enterprise which is actually enabling the final consumers to use AI, and the builders of AI, which is very important because these are the builders who are actually building those systems. So all three stakeholders, how we keep them in the center and heart of these new developments so that we use them responsibly.
Yeah, that's important.
Renée, I wanted to ask you something. And again, this is because last time we met, you had shared your interest as well around the work you have done on the digital marketing side. Your work around and your background around behavioral science, right, which is so critical for the subject actually, and about AI, right? So just wanted to ask you, this is very unique intersection of AI, behavioral science, and experience and customer experience or user experience. What led you to think of this intersection? Why you get excited about this intersection?
Yeah, well, thank you for asking that. So yeah, I tend to think I live in the overlapping concentric circles of behavioral science, augmented intelligence or artificial intelligence, if you will, and CX. And I came to that because of my background as a former practitioner. So I, for a living, used to think about how people make decisions and how to meet their needs. And then I moved into academia and started to think a lot more about the scientific underpinnings of the behaviors that we see and how we can orient and create relationships between firms and the people they serve that maximizes shared utility and minimizes harm. And then the part about artificial intelligence comes in because I witnessed sort of this breathless embrace of artificial intelligence in the hopes of reducing friction and increasing efficiency. And I think on the surface, that's really appealing, but my personal and research perspective gives me pause. The people who tend to experience harm first from these types of systems often look like me. I am a child of immigrants, I'm a Black woman. And when I read about the potential harms and the potential augmenting of existing inequality, it's hard for me not to say, hang on, the people who could potentially be harmed are people like me. And so I find it critical that I use my voice and my unique opportunity to have conversations with people like yourself who will then go on and advise these large firms to not automate the human out of these systems, because there are real people behind these data points, right? I'm pro data too, but we can't forget that each data point represents a human. And we can't forget that when we look at error terms, or we control for things like race or gender or socioeconomic status, this is not without real impact. So I started to think about that, I think from my personal perspective. And then I started to think about, well, what does this mean for the way in which our users, our consumers relate to our firms? And what I see happening is when there is this sort of scent of exploitation, when there is a sort of feeling of extraction without returning value, the risk of this is not only to the human, it's also bad business, right? Because then we have an orientation where people don't trust the firms, and rightfully so if they're concerned about harm, but also people are empowered. Things like data poisoning, right? Things like, sort of social movements to be against firms. And so I think that leadership involves absolutely centering the human, being rigorous before releasing into the wild things that affect these humans, but also having, I think, the courage and the ethics to say, we want to cultivate a system and a relationship with our customers whereby we don't simply always extract, but we also share value. And I think that that's what leads to loyalty in the long term, that sort of orientation. So that's where I come from as an individual. And I just happen to be tremendously fortunate that I am able to, at MIT, ask and raise these questions.
And this is good. And I think you did mention about the data, the bias in data, which is so critical. But you also mentioned about, I liked one of your speeches earlier about the frictionless AI.
Yeah.
Right? I think it'll be good to kind of discuss that. And I'll share something more with you in terms of the recent research we have done last year on artificial intelligence and what are we seeing. But before I go there, I think it may be worthwhile for getting your perspective on, I think everybody will get benefited from that dialogue as well in terms of your definition of what frictionless is.
Well, thank you. Yes. So, behavioral science and behavioral economics, everyone's read Thinking Fast and Slow, or at least everyone possesses or looked at the book and, is familiar with nudge and the idea that, you reduce friction in these systems to improve the likelihood that a human would make a decision that's optimal. Now, the embrace of behavioral economics in the world of technology and other kinds of systems has sort of sometimes forgotten that nudges are not meant to replace what someone's goal is. They're meant to get them to the goal they have already by reducing the friction between the person and their goal. So reducing the utility as defined by the user. When we sort of apply AI, though, and we forget about that, what happens is we start to embrace automaticity and we start to say, okay, let's remove friction from as many processes as possible. And so what I've observed is something that I call frictionless fever, where whether you're talking about healthcare systems, whether you're talking about consumer purchasing settings, so, you don't need a wallet, your face is your wallet, will scan your face. Or, even in education, an example, right, during COVID, where students in the UK weren't able to sit their exams due to COVID. And so a machine learning program was used to predict what their scores would have been so that, it could sort of move the process along and reduce the amount of friction. In financial services, right? Using models to sort of say, hey, we can do this faster and take out the human that adds too much friction into these processes. This frictionless fever is something that I sort of raised the kind of flag about that we need to be cautious of, because friction in and of itself is not bad, right? So if we think about it from a physics perspective, if you think about in physics, motion, if you think about a runner, too much friction is bad, right? Because the runner can't move, they get blisters and so on. But friction is also good because friction allows the person to accelerate. Friction allows the runner to change direction. And so it's really not a matter of let's remove friction. It's a matter of let's remove bad friction and let's add good friction. So I think that's the first question and the first nuance, frankly, that we need to embrace, right? It's not removing friction for friction's sake. It's how do we remove bad friction and how do we add good friction? And I think that's really important because we have things like ChatGPT frictionlessly creating overwhelming volumes of content. And then now we have AI search citing those volumes of content because they can dominate the data that are out there. So it's an increasing scale of information, but that also means it can increase the scale of misinformation. And it can also reduce the human element in terms of discernment, which is a good form of friction. So I tend to think about what can we do? What kinds of friction can we add to improve the systems? Knowing that these large language models don't have human cognition, although they're really good at assessing past data and using those data. So explainability, and I would like to ask you, Sanjeev, to talk about that because I know that's a big sort of emphasis on Accenture side, but explainability, right? What is this black box and helping people understand what's in the black box? Transparency in that way around performance and assumptions. And then, the research that we're doing at MIT to really look at how we can unpack this further. So let me maybe ask you, Sanjeev, to talk about explainability on Accenture's side and why that's important and what that means.
I think it's super important. I think let me just give you a context. I think what we are seeing is very critical as AI systems are going to be developed more in the future. And by the way, the research that I was mentioning you earlier, Renee, was research we did last year, and we went to 1,600 C-suite executives in various companies around 19 industries. And we asked them several questions in terms of their readiness for artificial intelligence and use of artificial intelligence. I just want to make sure that we aware in the big scheme of things, we rated them around two parameters. One is, do they have enough foundational capabilities, which means do they have skill sets to build AI systems? Do they have the platforms like which they need, technology which they need? Have they got right partners to work with them, and so on and so forth? So it's all about foundational capabilities to build systems there. And the other parameters was that how can they adopt in the business, like or for their consumer, or for their customer, or for their partners, right? Are they training them? How are they training them? How are they making them adopt the new ways of working? And we found 12% of the companies, what we started calling them achievers, which means they're able to influence the value coming from AI by using these two-dimensional framework, which means that they have enough of foundational capabilities and they have also been working on adopting AI. So I just want to let you know there's a lot of room of, potential room. Obviously, we all know that, by the way, that this is just like a major milestone on, especially this year when things are getting more and more commercialized, as you know, from foundational model perspective. But there's a potential is huge in the next few decades, right, if you may, in terms of how this will change the way companies will work, humans will work, and the way we're going to live and work both, right? So huge potential. Now, in terms of usage of AI, we also asked them a question saying, how many of them have thought about using the data and AI responsibly, right? And we found only 6% of them saying that they have some sort of a program. Now, nobody is kind of having the complete comprehensive program around this thing, but 6% people only said that they have, 6% of companies said that they have some sort of understanding of how to do it. So huge area of work actually required, Renee, in this space. I mean, the companies have to really figure out whether they should be using AI or not. Mm-hmm. Are they able to assess the risk? Like you just said, what's the harm you're talking about? Harm to people, harm to the brand, harm to reputation, harm to social environment? What are we talking about here, right? And how much is the intensity of harm so that you can spend resources accordingly in that space? There could be very low risk AI, which won't matter much. I mean, it's okay. And we can give some examples around that. For example, if you're using AI for generating a forecast for your sales, it's not going to harm people. It's going to just be inaccurate if you don't do it properly. You may have to increase accuracy of AI usage, but It's not going to harm any human being, right? So low risk versus if you're using AI for, let's say, surveillance, or you're using AI for let's say for any social cause or social distribution of allocation of funds, if you may, or using AI for hiring, recruitment. I mean, those can be high risk areas. You don't want it to be frictionless, and you want a good friction there, right? So in terms of, and when we look at these, what we are doing is we are helping companies build the capabilities to do that effectively. And there are four parts to that. So the first is to help them build a policy which can be linked to their core values, because they need to first feel it. Like leadership has to feel it. What is the core value of the company? How they want to use AI, and where they want to use AI, right? The second thing is to put an operating framework in terms of how they will govern the usage of AI across in the company and make themselves ready for use of AI as a company, which includes not only technology, but their compliance team, their legal teams, their functional teams, and so on and so forth. The third is to kind of build the tooling and capability, and that's where this comes in. I mean, so the principles comes in about fairness, about explainability, and fairness is one area which you just mentioned briefly, but explainability becomes more and more critical, because the question is, if AI has taken a decision or AI has helped you make a decision as a human, as a user, how is it doing it? And especially with the foundational models, when they're going to be working on large set of data sets, it need to be explained properly. So what we are doing is we are building, we have been working on this. We are building tool sets for explainability. So I can just give you one example. For example, for an insurance company, we are looking at claims processing process. So if you have met, if your car has met an accident, let's say auto, right? And you will do the first notice of claim by taking a picture. Every company has it now, as you must have seen. And then you are expecting the estimations to come back to you, right? As a claimant. Now, if the estimation has come through AI system, you're going to ask the question whether it's the right estimation or not, right? So it needs to be explained to you as a claimant, saying whether it's right or the system. So there's a way to explain that, because all these models can help you understand and explain, saying if the damage is done on the one part of the car, this is how much it takes. That it can, through computer vision technology, you can actually figure out how much is the intensity of damage and can explain the intensity to the actual cost of the damage, right? So the claimant actually gets more comfortable saying, okay, I got it. Like, this is how it's been done. And that's what is needed in the future, Renée, for any kind of AI usage. And first of all, the most important thing is to ensure that AI is also accountable and open to the consumer. So you have to declare upfront saying that you're using AI. And I think as we go along in the next few years, I think you will see more regulations around this process as well, where companies would have to declare it and and be very transparent to the consumer as well as to the regulators both.
Yeah, I agree with your expectation about the regulation. I'm encouraged by the AI Bill of Rights that has been developed by the White House's Office of Science and Technology Policy, fantastic group of people there. And I also agree with this point about having transparency for the user side, knowing, am I dealing with a human or am I dealing with a bot? What is the bot's assumptions? And we'll talk a little bit later about the research being done at MIT, but this level of transparency and kind of correcting this asymmetry of knowledge is one of the things that we're testing. So you bring up the issue about kind of responsible and explainability, and we're getting some really good comments in the chat. So I want to pick up on some of those, and I want to thank the folks who have been sending these questions and comments, some really good ones. Let me preface our conversation by saying that Sanjeev, I think we can agree that we're not going to solve every problem regarding AI in this conversation. We're going to try. but we probably
we're going to share our experience. That's what we can do.
we will probably try, but likely fail, and that's okay. We know our limitations, right? Our hope is to help people understand that that we're thinking about this and give some ideas around it. So the first one is really interesting, and this person mentions, how about the tech that can impersonate humans, fake humans based on human speech, human appearance, body language, and the use of slang, called generative AI. Now, I don't know if you've seen this, Sanjeev, but I've seen this being used not just in sort of creating kind of a chat bot, like a Siri type person, but or something for a video game, but being used to almost resurrect people who've passed on, right? So historical figures or perhaps someone in one's family, you can take a photo of them from your family tree and ostensibly have a conversation with an ancestor. And then, of course, when we talk about visual generation, we've seen people use DALL-E and so on to create art and product in the ilk of what an artist, for instance, or a content creator would make. What are you seeing, and what are your sort of thoughts on that, Sanjeev?
My thoughts is I always go back to my previous comment about AI to value. That's how I think. I mean, that's my thinking. That's the pattern I'm building, because it's technology is given to us. We can use it in many ways, but I think like we were discussing earlier, we need to ensure that we ask right questions, right? What are we using it for? Right? And that it goes back to your question. I mean, once we have decided that, then the friction and good friction, bad friction comes because I love that concept that you have. But I think the first question is, why are you using it for, right? So if you're using a generative AI, let's call it generative AI. It's people used to call, like people were calling it deepfakes this last year, right? About various things which happened in the market for wrong usage of, let's say, wrong use of AI. But if you look at generative AI, I mean, if you're using it for, assuming, I was looking at a use case where they're using it for reducing the cost of filmmaking. Right. So, for example, some of the things that you're shooting, you don't know the exact location. In fact, by the way, it's being used right now, right? So there are a lot of use of that where you can use generative AI for capturing the locale, which is very hard to go, right? You can actually use it for you don't have to, you can save a lot of cost in logistics, crew shipment, everything else because of use of this generative AI. If you're using it for that, I think it's a right use for the technology. But if you're using for wrong purposes, I think that's where it goes into discussion, Renée, in terms of whether you're using it for right or wrong reasons. And once you decide, then I think depending on the risk you are taking for using AI, I think that when the question comes up, how much human is in the loop, right, for deciding and making decisions of how the AI is behaving for the use case. But that will be the way I would think about, always from the use case perspective rather than actually from a technology perspective, use of technology. Does it make sense?
Yeah. So I think, from my perspective, and there are a couple of questions that ask this with regard to not just, sort of impersonating humans, but foundational models and things of that nature. For me, a common denominator or a question to ask is sort of who benefits and where the power structure is. So when I think about things like creating, fake people or creating art inspired by real artists, or even, creating content using real humans, the question becomes for me, not just, is this something that can help us more efficiently do work, but who benefits, right? So those content creators, are these benefits, is this value that otherwise would go to them, but is being circumvented because now a model is doing it, right? So are we literally taking, power and food from the mouths of content creators? That's a really important question for me to ask, because generally speaking, the people who are most harmed by this don't have the most power, right? So if you can create art or music or some other content in the style of someone who is, for instance, an emerging content creator, you've cut off that person's opportunity to, get compensation for their work, the influence that they could have, et cetera. So I think the lens of power is a really important one to keep here. And when we're asking about generative models, or we're asking about so-called foundational models, right? The question is, well, who's building that foundation, and what were their incentives and objectives before we sort of say, this is the foundation that we all should now sort of have a path dependency building on. I think these issues of productivity are important, but the question around profit generation is important too. And it's important that we not just have the existing power players be able to extract value, it's important that we expand that we are able to give other people who otherwise would have the opportunity to create content, to share their services, to convey their, ideas and so on, that they're not boxed out of it as we create these foundational models that are built to sort of calcify systems that are already in place. So some of the questions around, can foundational models be useful without some guidance? I think before we even talk about human in the loop and how to guide, we really should be asking about power, because let's be honest, humans are biased as well. I mean, I just stated at the very beginning my own bias, right? Which is, given my own perspective and lived experience, I am biased toward asking about harm. And so, the bias can exist, but we need to find out, okay, well, given the power structures that there are we sort of amplifying, these sorts of issues? So I think, in addition, Sanjeev, to your question about where is there not harm being committed, where are we able to do things that, kind of allow us to continue the work that we're doing, we also want to ask, well, what are the power structures and what role do we want to play? I think, your point earlier, Sanjeev, what kind of business do we want to be in? What kind of leaders are we? Do we want to be the kind of people who calcify in existing structures? Do we want to be the kind of people who box out others who would otherwise gain access? What kind of business do we want to be in? And what orientation do we want toward the people we claim to serve, who are our customers, who are citizens? These are important questions. And by the way, these are questions that cannot be answered by a model. These are uniquely human questions, right?
This goes back to the policies, actually, for the companies and organization, how they set up the policies in terms of the value structure. I think you're talking about value structure, which is basically, if they are creating, the fundamental question, where should they use AI and how they create value for people who are involved or the stakeholders that are involved, I think is super critical, right? And that question. So I think very fundamental, very, very nice question. I think it will also evolve. I think this question and the answer and response to this will evolve with the policies which are going to come from various governments and regulations which come. I think that will also influence, and that's more the reason that regulators have to really understand the implications of these technologies as fast as the corporates are learning, or the high-tech companies are learning, or the ones who are evolving AI faster, if you may. So that there's a balance in discussion and balance in the communication in terms of what are the implications, who's need to be benefited. Just a question that you're saying, there's a right equal play from the content creators and the content consumers.
Yes. Who is part of the conversation is also critical and something that needs to be addressed. Very important point. So here's a question. It says, hi, Renee. Hi. Is the use of smart AI a risk to the work and effort required by students? Previously, universities would check for plagiarism. Is the AI the new threat for people who want to abuse the new technology? I think that's a really great question. So I think it's a two-part answer. The first part is, if you're going to be relying on large language models to do your work for you, the work that ostensibly would be your creative, leveraging your cognition and so on, be prepared for the result. I think the best case scenario is insipid output, in that it will just be a reflection of what's already out there, because these models are really good at, sort of continuing on the path of what's already available. And as an educator, if you're the kind of educator where your work really centers around, sort of parroting what's out there, answering, asking questions of your students that don't require a lot of critical thinking, but really are just sort of memorization tasks, then yeah, I think you should be worried, because just like a calculator can very efficiently, sort of do math problems, these models can very efficiently sort of, reflect what's out there. So if you're using this, the best case scenario is insipid output. And by the way, this goes for content creators, advertising agencies, copywriters, right? Sort of hewing closely to what's already there. But the worst case scenario, right, is error. The worst case scenario is inaccuracy and bias that's mass produced. So be aware of that. Now, for me, way back in the day when I was a student, a doctoral student, my thesis looked at counterfeiting. And it's so funny how this has kind of come full circle with fake news and AI. And I looked at counterfeits and I looked at what the impact of counterfeits were on the actual authentic goods. And there were some surprising findings. And the biggest surprise for me was that when humans are able to be discerning, it actually makes them appreciate the real thing more. So an example from the Brooklyn Museum, when they learned that their relics were infiltrated by some fakes, they put on display the fake next to the real thing and allowed people to look at both of those and discern, gee, what makes something inauthentic? And what can we appreciate about the real thing that the fake absolutely can't create? And so to answer your question also, when it comes to educators or students, I think a really good exercise would be to enable that discernment, to look at how these models don't replace the real thing, and to continue to use human cognition as a means of appreciating what cannot be replaced by automated models. I think that's a really good way of continuing to appreciate the fact that these are not sentient and that they can't replace human. So thanks for that. Thanks for that question. Sanjeev, do you want to?
Yeah, I was just saying, what about authenticity? I mean, that's very important for education, right? I mean, all of us have studied. I mean, I actually like the analogy of the calculator because, like, for example, not the calculator, but let's say when I was in the college, there was a introduction of scientific calculator, which was quite advanced calculator at that point of time. Like, all the kids are using it now in high school, but it used to be used in, engineering colleges. And I think when we were using for the first time, you felt that you can do a lot faster. Like you don't have to do the calculations. Come on. The whole page that we just write at the back for some calculation page, there used to be a separate page for calculation. That was all gone because it was so fast on the site, right? But it didn't help to answer the conceptual question or the fundamental question being asked by the professor, right? Saying, how will you solve this puzzle or how will you solve this machine problem? So I'm just thinking aloud. I mean, I think that still will be very difficult. Like, I mean, you can get best case answers from this, but the genuinity in terms of, what should be authentic, like even authentic writer and the style of writing is very personal, I think, in my view, Renée. And it will always remain personal for the authors who are really experts in writing. And the same thing will be for the artist as well. I mean, there will still be, but yes, I think lots of, I'm assuming it will become an aid rather than actually something which becomes a competition to people, right?
That's right. That's right. And I think that in and of itself is putting it in is making a conscious decision about what role you want it to play, right? And putting it in sort of the role as an assistant. So yes. So another question that's come up: AI invading individual privacy. And in addition to the sort of discrimination issues that we've talked about, causing social discrimination of individual and community and invading privacy. Comments on that. I'm interested, Sanjeev, to see what, if anything, is sort of being discussed by your clients. I think on our end, in the academic world, so to speak, this is a very real concern. The idea that, when you give sort of an inch, companies wanting to take a mile with regard to your information, and this notion that, data is the new sort of oil, leading to kind of a desire to obtain as much data on people as possible as a means of sort of cross-selling or something like that. For the person who asked this question, I think it's a critical issue. I think it's an issue with regard to trust and the nature of the relationship between firms and their customers. When you feel like your privacy is being invaded or you're being manipulated, it destroys trust. In terms of the implications, my suggestion, Chris Gilliard does some fantastic research on the issue of privacy and surveillance, so I would recommend that. But Sanjeev, I'm interested to hear from your perspective. How are people thinking about this issue of privacy?
I mean, from the customer perspective, I think our guidance on the framework has been to take consent. But again, look, we deal with the much of larger companies, and then and talk from the governance point of view in terms of how they would like to see. And most of the cases, I think they really want to understand. For example, even the C-suite is very clear for most of the companies to have been made aware of these implications vis-a-vis smaller companies, if you know, right? So more of a small tech companies have been little more, let's say, pro AI or pro technology, if you may, and then pushing a lot of things into the market. But I think all the large corporations are very careful in terms of understanding the implications of what need to be done and how it's need to be done, frankly. So, but consent mechanisms are the right mechanisms in terms of making sure people or your customer and users are aware of what they are sharing and for what purpose are they sharing? Are they getting benefited of the sharing the information? And if yes, what it means to them. Plus the other discussion that we had earlier, I think when we met last time, frankly, was about, the, you called it something called as
digital lobster trap.
Lobster trap, yes. And I love that concept because that's what I think, and I think, do you want to explain that, Renée, for 2 minutes? Because I was thinking about it after coming back to meeting you, saying that, okay, what traps I've been into, right? So.
Yeah. So, if you're familiar with the concept of dark patterns, these are sort of a corruption, if you will, of behavioral economics and nudging people into arrangements that are exploitative. But what I talk about is a sort of specific form of it called that I call digital lobster traps. And it's a New England, I'm in New England, so lobster traps make sense. But essentially, if you're familiar with a lobster trap, there's bait inside the trap and the lobster climbs in and is caught in this net. And a lobster actually can get out, but it's extremely difficult. So from a friction perspective, it's relatively frictionless for the lobster to enter. In fact, there's a ton of incentive to enter, but it's filled with friction when the lobster decides, okay, I've had enough and I'd like to go. And so what you can look at is you find these digital lobster traps everywhere. And so when we think about this issue of privacy, just because I've given permission or I've entered and followed the bait to give access to some of my data doesn't mean that while I'm there, you now have the right to do with me what you wish. And so being careful about digital lobster traps as being frictionless to enter and friction filled to leave is I think, a concern that we all should take on.
Yeah, it happens every day, by the way. So,
yes, it does.
I enrolled into, how much subscriptions you must be doing right now for everything, right? I mean, I don't even keep a track now. It's too much actually. It's everything is subscribed and you pay per use for news, for articles, for the streaming videos, everything else, right? So
that's right.
And I realize that in some cases it's fine, but in some cases it's hard to get out.
It's hard to get out. And I think we're seeing with some entertainment platforms, for instance, people really pushing back to say, well, hang on, you're changing the rules of the game mid-game, right? Now, it's one thing to say, okay, well, we have some costs, our prices are increasing, but it's quite another to say the nature of this service, this platform, this product is changing, and it's quite effortful for you to get out. And so this is, I think, something that breeds mistrust. And then, you can't be surprised when customers engage in things, you lament people, sharing access or taking backdoor routes. And it's like, well, if you create a dynamic whereby it's, kind of kill or be killed, then you can't really be surprised when people are just in survival mode and protecting themselves. So I think it's something that, all sort of user journeys need to be evaluated and looked at for this issue. So here's another question, and I realize we don't have a ton of time. Gosh, that time really flew, Sanjeev. I feel like, what happened? I'm being given the 5-minute warning, but I do want to bring up another question, and I apologize if we can't get to all the questions and comments. We would love to do more. Right, so here's another. How do we wish AI to deal with the trolley problem scenarios in domains such as automated cars and medical treatment? Decisions will be made that value some lives more than others. Thank you for that question. I think this is a critical one. This is one actually that we've been doing some research on at MIT, where we've shown kind of the after effect of human decisions that have been made with AI input. And on this research I work with Dave Rand and Ziv Epstein, both who are at MIT. What we find is that essentially when people look at the outcome of these decisions, when an algorithm has given input to the decision, people reduce the perceived responsibility or accountability of the human in a way that diffuses the responsibility, similarly to how you would see that happen if a group of humans made the decision. So it's a very important question. Well, how do you think about this, Sanjeev?
No, I think it's an important question as well. I think, as rightly said, I think the diffusion of responsibility is very much seen when AI gets in action, and I think that's more the reason that you need to. The approach one need to take is that we need to we need to just really break down the structure of the process and ensure that it's not about human taking a look at things when everything is done. It's actually working in tandem. It's like human and machine working tandem, and there could be multiple touch points in the process of a process. Like, for example, I was mentioning claims processing or any other process, frankly, but it has to be, or even driving a car, right? There's to be a process of making sure the human and the car and everything has a constant touch point and connection, and they're melding together in terms of making a decision rather than actually doing it after the insight has been provided, or or something, which because then responsibility reduces, Renee. I mean, if there's a constant discussion with somebody, then it's a conversation between the two, and I think the responsibility still stays and accountable. It still stays with human finally.
Human, that's right. And so, I think that's a really good way to end it. Think about, like, should AI be doing this, right? Where's the human cognition leading things, the explainability that you discussed before, the diverse sort of stakeholders that we talked about before. And there's much more to come, but I am being given the flashing light that we're out of time. So let me thank you, Sanjeev, for taking the time to sit in the hot seat with me and answer these questions. I want to thank everybody who submitted questions and comments, and thank you to MIT and Accenture for giving us the opportunity to think about these really important issues. Over to you, Devin.
Thank you.
Thanks, Renee. Thanks, Sanjeev. And with that, we will take our next break. We'll return at the top of the hour again at 1 p.m. Eastern Time for our keynote address from Sinan Aral for job seekers. Do weak ties still bind? See you at 1.